Great, thank you. Okay, so I thought I'd briefly skip through an introduction to Peatland Finance Ireland and the Peatland Standard that we have just launched for public consultation. Thank you very much for all of your interest in this. We've had a huge and positive response since last week when we did launch it. I'm not going to get into the detail of the standard itself. That's for my colleague Brian Irvine on this call as well. I'll just give a brief introduction to who we are and why you're on this call with us. Well, hopefully many of you are aware that peatlands are extremely important. 3% of the land, but 30% of the soil carbon globally, twice that of all forests, so they are important. They do have value beyond carbon though. So aside from carbon in Ireland, we also have significant water benefit from these areas in terms of the filtration, the reducing sediment load and reducing nutrient load, attenuating the flow of that water and increasing soil stability. There's also massive biodiversity benefits as well in terms of compliance with existing directives, and then a diverse set of ecosystem services, some of which is known and some of which is not yet known. There's also wise use around these wetlands. So some might call it carbon farming, some might call it polluticulture, food, fuel and fibre. But I suppose the harder thing to quantify really is the culture, amenity and maybe even spirituality around these areas. So they are important. Some of those importances can have a figure attached to them, others less so, but we maybe are getting there. In Ireland specifically, our peatlands look quite diverse. In fact, many of them you won't see because they're under trees. Their proportions are there on the screen for you now. What we're aiming to do, however, with Peatland Finance Ireland is to establish and ensure the management of a blended system of financing to ensure the restoration of these areas, and that is actively incentivized and that is respectfully quantified. Just so to embed a little bit of trust, legitimacy and independence in who we are a quite broad set of stakeholders. We are now a not-for-profit organisation, a CLG in Irish terms. We have broad support from various government departments on the screen there. We have semi-state organisations, academic institutions, community groups, etc., etc. We have very strong regulatory linkage through Peatland Finance Ireland. So we are included in Ireland's Climate Action Plan, on our National Biodiversity Action Plan. But at EU level, we also have very, very strong connectivity with whether it's the Green Deal, the existing directives, and there is a milieu of those, emissions obligations, and then more recently, the emergence of the Carbon Farming and Removal Certification, CRCF, and the thankfully now up and coming Nature Restoration Law and the national restoration plans associated with them. In addition to that, there is corporate drivers. So on the other side of the fence, I suppose, in terms of CSRD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and various other ones, in particular some sectoral stuff like the CORSIA one linked to airline. What we try to deal with in PFI is what I deem certainty versus certainty. So on one side, academic certainty, which is obviously of very, very high levels of rigor, and on the other side, corporate or business certainty, which needs to move fast and adapt to markets as they emerge. And there are obviously characteristics of both of those that don't often align. So some tend to be quite slow, some tend to be almost too quick in some regards. And that's where PFI comes in. We attempt to hold those hands and bring parties forward. I won't get too deep into the principles of our organization. We can share these slides afterwards, I'm sure, as well, but this is all public. We are not for profit. We try to help the smallest landowners first. As an example, how we could align with one of those specific reporting obligations is the CSRD. And on the screen there in front of you, you can see that many institutions, and particularly large organizations, will be required to report on their deficit in terms of their impact. What we can offer with a certified system through the Peatland Standard is a means of reporting on exactly how you can reduce that impact. Again, Brian will get into much greater detail on this, but overall, this is what we will be proposing to you today. A bundled ecosystem certificate that is greater than the sum of its parts and potentially also in terms of value and what it can generate for landowners and land users. Again, Brian will go through the details of this, but we do have quite a chunk of documentation backing this up now, and it's all open for your scrutiny and gentle criticism, hopefully. One of the important elements of this is how we combine these. We can offer what's called a true stack or a stacked set of ecosystem services. So carbon, water, biodiversity, etc. And that's it on the right-hand side of the screen there. On the left-hand side, it's all bundled into a simple implicit bundle, which is maybe a nature certificate or something like that. However, ultimately, we know that individual investors may want to report on the individual metrics within that. So we have landed in the middle, what I increasingly deem a bag of sweets, where various entities may be entering this market based on a particular ecosystem service or reporting obligation. But in order to get that, you do need to bring the others along with you. So the less tasty sweets, the licorice or something else in that bag. And that could represent in this circumstance the biodiversity, the social uplift, even though you're only interested predominantly in the water or the carbon. We do have reasons to be cheerful around this. So Irish peatlands in particular tell a very convincing story. It is undeniable that the need is there in terms of finance and ecological improvement. There's huge compliance markets now emerging, which is very, very positive for us. It's obviously very vital economically and culturally. And there's an increasing amount of impact investment emerging too. So it goes beyond the simple return on investment, which is useful. And then hopefully we hope to go beyond peatlands themselves. So they do not operate in isolation in the landscape. There are many different elements of that, and especially if we look at a catchment level or a hydrological unit level, peatlands are intrinsic to that, but we can start to capture the other elements of that. So we have good ambition to become what we hope to call Nature Finance Ireland. I guess one particular question that I have oftentimes for communities when we reach out with a particular standard like this is do I want this? If so, what does it look like? Who is not here? That should be. And importantly, who do I not trust and why? So whenever I do talk to community groups, I want to ensure that I'm listening to their concerns and that we understand why they may not want to immediately enter a system like this. I'm going to put the final slide up here. You can drop us an email and talk a bit further, but I'll wrap it up for now, Leisha, and I'll stop sharing. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Shane. Okay, so before we get into the presentation on the standard itself, I'm just going to run through a few quick housekeeping things about the consultation. Can you see my screen now?
We can, yeah.
Okay, so just the timeline for the public consultation. We opened on the 5th of November. Now the webinar is today, 14th of November, and then it will close on the 5th of December. So then between December and January 2025, we'll review all comments and prepare the responses. And then the standard is set to launch version 1.0 in February 2025, and this will be along with the comments and responses, which will be published. So then, as Shane mentioned, there's quite a lot of documents available on the PFI website. So this is accessible from the homepage. So just some of the key documents, if you're a bit overwhelmed when you're looking at everything, we'd really recommend that you look at the summary of the standards, then the Peatland Standard document itself, also the field protocol and the frequently asked questions. So 4 of these documents are right at the top of the webpage, so you can't miss them. Then there's also the summary of the case studies and their outputs. And then if you're interested as well, we'd recommend that you look at the calculators. So particularly the emission scoping, the emission reduction, and the ecosystem services calculators. We also have calculators for the 2 case studies, and you can email us and we can send these to you separately if you're interested in looking at those as well. And then just if you are interested in responding, again, we recommend that you review the public consultation documents. So that's linked at the top of the web page as well. So within the consultation document, you'll see that there's a list of 9 questions for the public consultation across a few different categories. And then also within the document, you'll see a linked Google form and also a downloadable Excel. So this is if you want to make comments on the specific text. And then within the Google form, there will also be the 9 questions. And it's not mandatory to answer all of the questions, so you can pick and choose. And just to note as well, that as I said, we'll be publishing all of the responses for transparency. but unless you want your name published alongside your responses, we'll automatically keep it anonymous. And then if you have any questions throughout the process, you can always email us at info@peatlandfinance.ie. So I will hand over to you now, Brian. I have your slides up here.
Great. Thank you, Alicia. Folks, my name is Brian Irvine, and I'm a senior environmental technologist with a background in peatland restoration in open moorland, shallow, deep, and forest to bog. So I've been working with PFI for this last year, developing the standard. So thank you very much for your interest today. To follow on from Shane's comments, really the standard is about providing a mechanism to assess change, to quantify ecosystem improvements, verification of the metrics to enable investors to use the metrics to report. The key features really is we're looking for group and catchment projects to reduce the administration cost and to increase the impact. And we're, as Shane says, we're interested in more than carbon and biodiversity, and we're basing this on site-specific results, so rather than generic figures. Next slide, please, Lisa. Just to show where we are at this stage, we're on the third buff-coloured box on the right. We're at the wider public consultation phase. And as Lisa says, we will be launching hopefully in 2025. There's a couple of pilot projects already close to be signed up, so they will move with it. And then eventually we will refine our versions. This is based on the voluntary market, which has been around for 10 to 15 years now. And Shane has mentioned these big ones, CSRD, and the other one is CRCF, the Carbon Removals, Carbon Farming Certification Regulation. So we've been making sure we're aligned with that, and then more laterally, in the last month, we've been feeding into its development as well. Next slide, please, Lisa. The basis of the structure. So really, we've stood on the shoulders of all these other organisations in producing this. So the voluntary market has 10 core carbon principles that really set the whole thing very well. There is the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, which sets principles for biodiversity metrics, and Society of Ecological Restoration have a series of principles as well, which we can follow. From the EU side of things, there is an ecosystem accounting framework, which we have included in this, and then CRCF and CSRD, obviously. But these four codes on the right-hand side have been invaluable to follow, and we're indebted to the assistance from the Peatland Code UK in working with us and in using some of their templates as well. But the key thing is that we're making a product that is specific to Ireland, and it's for use in Ireland and for corporates who work in Ireland. Next slide, please, Lisa. So the basis of the quantification for the standard. So really thinking about carbon, first of all, there's generic emission factors. So the IPCC have international northern temperate peatlands tier 1 figures, which are very good. We have national emission factors, which have improved on those tier 1 factors. However, those national figures don't cover the many different types of peatland we have. We've sort of averaged them together, so they work for tens of thousands of hectares, but when we bring them down to a 100-hectare project, they are unable to show change for us. So that's where we're going to tier 3, and tier 3 is maybe using models or using local site research. And we're lucky we have great NPWS raised bog data from Clara and Abby Lee, which helps us with the raised bog vegetation types. And then for all other types, we're using the water level model. So the water level model is used by the Dutch and the Germans, and it's also used in Fen Peats in the UK. So it's really giving site-specific results, and it's based on the model of Evans et al. 21 and 23. Then from the point of view of biodiversity, there is 53 international biodiversity systems. We're looking at the Wallacea methodology, which is really using a basket of 5 metrics. Rather than concentrating on one thing to measure biodiversity, it's saying, look, this is complex. Let's use a range of metrics. And importantly, we're linking it to a reference site. So what a priority habitat should look like, and not just what a biodiversity uplift is. Because obviously, if we change from a dry heath, a dry heather bog, and we change to a wet bog, we will have changed the species and the proportions, but we won't actually not necessarily have a percentage uplift. But so it's to a reference site we're looking for. Volumetric water benefit is an international system that is used, and we're working with a couple of international companies at present on some projects. And in actual fact, this is the one that is of more interest than carbon and biodiversity to some companies. So I'll say a wee bit about that later. And then we're also looking at published research for flood alleviation, water quality, community, wildfire reduction, carbon storage, and erosion losses. And we're trying to include as much of that as possible within the standard. For a number of reasons, it makes it more complicated, but the benefit is that it gives us a higher value because at current prices on carbon and biodiversity, it wouldn't work without looking at the whole here. Next slide, please, Alicia. Shane's already used this one. So this is the CSRD. So this is why we're trying to spread it further than carbon and biodiversity. And it's really to look on the left-hand side. Those are the sustainability standards that companies are reporting on. This is from 2024 for large companies. So they'll be reporting in January 25 to start with. That's companies with more than 500 employees, and then it'll be moving further down to smaller companies in later years. You can see the list in the light grey there: climate change, adaptation, mitigation, water consumption, water impacts, drivers of biodiversity loss, climate change, impact on the state of species. So companies are meant to be reporting on this as an impact and on what they're doing to reduce their impact, and then finally on voluntary mitigation projects. So peatlands are fantastic for fitting into all this. So in the dark grey there, you can see a company might be reporting in kilotons of CO2, in tens of thousands of meter cubed of water use, in their biodiversity impact for a specific site, and then their share on species loss due to their climate change impact. And Scope 3 is involved in this, and Scope 3 is, of course, their customers' impacts with the products that have been sold to them. So the fourth column on the right just gives examples of what a voluntary project that a company invests in, what could be reported on. So it could be so many tons of CO2 emission reduction, 20,000 meter cubed per year of increased water retention in the bog, water quality impacts. It could be on biodiversity, it could be removal of invasive species, generally biodiversity uplift, and particular species relevant to certain areas. So there's the way this reporting is done is it's actually each project is referenced again and again under different headings. So it fits very well. Next slide, please, Lisa. So this is what we're selling. So we are selling a project's metrics. We're selling a verified certificate, an ecosystem certificate. It will list tons and meters cubed and hectares, because that is actually what the companies will be using to report on. So a very conservative example here is a small 25-hectare Midlands raised bog, 5-centimeter water table change. You'd always be hoping for more than that for 10 or 15 centimeters. But looking at this one, it would have an annual emission reduction of 40 tonne of CO2 per year. It would have 4,000 meter cube per year of increased water retention. We could say it has over 1,000 tonne of carbon immediate protection. It'll have a percentage biodiversity uplift compared to priority habitat reference sites. So we could quote some of the specific groups. So it might be a 10% annual increase in Odinata and damselflies and dragonflies, depending on the community interest or the landowner's interest in what metrics they would use for biodiversity. We are interested in social engagement, so that community aspect. Water quality is a big one, and wildfire risk and impact reduction is an important one as well. Okay, so that's next slide, please, Lisa. Okay, so a couple of general comments is that we're using both models and direct measurement depending on what we're doing. So we have to be very wary of that and take a level of uncertainty into consideration. A key feature of the voluntary market is conservativeness. Accuracy of applications across the wider area. So obviously we're going to measure change in one particular place, and we have to use methods that mean we can use that to state what the change is across the wider area. So it's all about assessing change. This is going to improve, so our models are going to get more accurate and more reliable the more they're used. So that is the really important part of the pilot projects. And looking to the future, we know that we're going to have more reliable, cheaper and faster methods, particularly with remote sensing. But we're not there yet, but we will be. Focusing on carbon in particular, so raised bogs is going to be done by vegetation type assessment, so ecotope assessment from the Clara and Abbey Lee work. Bare peat, we have an emission factor change. There's enough data there from various sites to give us an emission factor change. Blanket bog, grassland will be done by water level, because our national emission factors are too generic to use, and they hide what could actually go on. So we could have one site which would fall into, might have a water table depth of 40 centimeters. Another one might have 10 centimeters or 15 centimeters. We might go in and restore, and we get very different results because of the starting point. Yet if we use a generic emission factor, it would be the same in both categories. So site-specific really helps in this situation. So that's where the water level comes in. We have quite a lot of extreme sites in Ireland, from our extraction industry and from forest to bog. So we are obviously going to have transition stages with those extreme ones. So water level will be a part of the measurement of that. So it's very important that we acknowledge those transition factors. We will get considerable methane burps in these activities, where we end up or start with bare peat. We will have very different stages to go through. It won't be a case of going from A to C immediately. It will, or A to E immediately. It will go through quite a lot of transition phases. Okay, next slide, Lisa, please. So to give you an idea of some of the calculators and some of the calculations, we'll have a look at a few of them here. We can only touch the surface today, but it gives you an opportunity to put questions in the chat and ask questions at the end of the meeting. So we're looking at first of all, a raised bog example, looking at vegetation method for emissions here. If you look at the light blue box in the middle, so we are going to put in on the baseline, we put in this example, with 45 hectares are under marginal and 5 hectares that are classified as face bank. And those two have emission factors we are using on the left-hand side. Then the restoration column shows where we got to after 5 years. Say we had the 5 hectares of face bank reprofiled and revegetated. We had the marginal moved down from 45 hectares to 10, and 35 hectares became submarginal. So that gives us a baseline emission of 364, a restored of 167. So an emission reduction of 197 tonne of CO2 equivalent per year for this 50 hectare site. So that's a 54% reduction in emissions. If you look at the two columns on the left, you can see that the second one, GWP, is really the global warming potential. So that's the factor that we talk about. And you can see that all the categories are emitting. And this is because methane obviously has a much higher global warming impact. So it is, so even central, subcentral, which is the categories we want to get to, are still emitting 1 or 2 tonnes, but it's really the change from face bank and marginal down to the other categories. That's really what achieves the change for us. There's a wee bit more to the story. So the column on the left is really about net ecosystem carbon balance. So that's really talking about kilograms of carbon and not converting to global warming. And the key thing we know is that central and subcentral ecotopes are actually, they're active, they're peat forming. So they are trapping more carbon than they're releasing. And that's obviously, we're trying to get as much land into those categories as possible. And in actual fact, when we look at the net ecosystem carbon balance, we get a much greater reduction than we do just from the global warming impact. So that there's a long-term story in what we're trying to do and get to a higher proportion of active peatland. So we can use these vegetation emission factors for raised bogs and for bare peat and hags and gullies and blanket bogs. And then we're going to have to use a different methodology for the areas where we don't have as accurate factors. So next slide, please, Leisha. Thank you. And really, this is the water table methodology. There's a number of models in Europe, and this one is Chris Evans' model. And you can see the two graphs on the left. We have a lovely relationship between water table depth and CO2, and on the right with a relationship between water table depth and methane. And it's really combining these two within a calculator. As well as that, we've also put in DOC, POC, and nitrous oxide. You can see the calculator above then in the light blue boxes. It has the hydrological unit or area, in this case 10 hectares. It has the baseline water table depth. The background models are running, and we can add in ditch fraction and bare peat fraction as well to modify these a bit. Again, we've picked a very conservative 5 centimeter water table change for this blanket bog, and we're getting in this situation 19.5 tonne reduction. And that reduction is also in there's a short version and a longer version, and the longer version lists all the different metrics and lists the net ecosystem carbon balance as well. This is difficult in how much information to put out there, but what we have found on our journey is that large companies employ scientists and accountants, and they want to see the background behind all the metrics. Some other people want to see very little of the background. So what we've tried to do with the calculators is leave the first 2 pages where all the information happens, and then the back pages are left open for people to go and look and see where the data came from, what the references are, and the rationales behind them. So if you have time, I would encourage you to look at the emission reduction calculator and the ecosystem calculator as well. Okay, next slide, Lisa, please. Really, this is some of the other things that we can calculate. So if we're doing the water table methodology, that's allows us to do other things. And with that same data, we can actually do a volumetric water benefit assessment. So that is done by the change in water table multiplied by the impact. It's called the specific yield. The specific yield that we're taking as a default is around 0.2. And that really means that if you get 4 millimeters of rain falling on a bog, then you will get the water table rising by 20 millimeters in the dip well. So it's because the temporary water storage really is in macro pores, whereas there's a lot of water already held in the peat in micropores. So even though peat is 97% water content, it's actually the macro pores where the water storage happens in. So specific yield works out by taking rainfall divided by water level change. So we already have water level change, and we have 433 Met-Earn rainfall data collection points around the country. So we have the ability to work out this volumetric water benefit. And the water companies we've been working with have been delighted at the robustness of this data. We've worked it out for a couple of bogs, and one bog came out at around 0.16, so very similar to our default as expected for a raised bog, and another one was considerably higher than a blanket bog. So this one, you can see in the 2 lines here, we at a very conservative, we might get 10,000 meter cubed from 100 hectares at a 10 centimeter water change, and an overly optimistic water yield, we might get up to 70,000. So its site-specific results are really important for us. Carbon store protection is another thing that we get from our ground survey. So from peat depth, applying a conservative peat bulk density and carbon fraction, we can say that if we change the water table by 5 centimeters, we end up with in 100 hectares 1,875 ton of carbon with immediate protection within this project lifetime. And looking at the total carbon store within a site, again we can say that in this 1 meter depth, 100 hectares, we have 37,500 ton of carbon protected. So there's additional things we can say to add to the story from a simpler range of data collection. Next slide, please, Lisa. So really, where do we get all these metrics from? So the key thing is the emission reduction is from ecological survey. Eventually, that will be from AI interpretation of remote sensing. Dip wells and loggers will be needed for a lot of sites. Some research sites will have higher methods, the chain flux towers and chambers, and though that will help us improve our models, and we'll be able to use those higher methods. I've mentioned volumetric water benefit. It tags on behind. Biodiversity is a difficult one to measure. We have to measure to a reference site. We have the national advantage of the acre scorecard system in Ireland, and it's how we can maximize that to the best. So what else do we need to add into the scorecard system? We use it as one of our basket of 5 metrics. We also use it in group projects so that we can have some reference data on some fields in some farms, and then use the scorecard data to bring the rest in along. Water services, so we've talked about flood alleviation, water quality. That's obviously expensive to set up flumes and loggers, and so that will be available for some sites, but not for all, depending on the investment. And then there's other metrics that are important: wildfire impact and risk reduction, social metrics, and carbon. Those are quite moderately costed to enable us to use those as well. Next slide, please, Alicia. Okay, so this is our model for what happens really. Stage 1 is about project concept and design. Stage 2 is about the restoration works. There's an awful lot of work between stage 1 and stage 2. I'll refer to that in a minute. But restoration works is really funded by investor and potentially government assistance in the future. Stage 3 is about management, maintenance, and monitoring, reporting, and verification. And stage 3 goes on for maybe 50 years, because we obviously going to need income to continually manage these peatlands and to maintain them, and to do the monitoring, which becomes easier over time. So really our target is obviously restored, resilient peatlands, which there is still funding to manage and maintain, and those hit our national and international targets. But it's the output of the MRV, which is the verified metrics, and really those go back to the investor in recompense for their capital for the restoration works. So how soon those go back and for how long they go back depends on the contract and the individual project, and obviously the landowner will have a percentage, or from 0 to 100 depending on the project, obviously of those metrics as well. Okay, next slide please, Lisa. Okay, this is just to show you the difference between stage 1 and stage 2. There's a lot that has to happen, a lot of mapping, surveying, there's planning application, there is project design, and consultations from the point of view of neighbours, archaeology, planning. So quite a lot going on, how to protect neighbouring sites from the hydrology. There's a process of engaging validation, a third-party independent company as validation of the project, and then verification at intervals thereafter. So a lot going on in the first 1 to 3 years, and then thereafter it's about some annual monitoring and then verification milestones, where verification might happen initially at 5 years, then maybe every 10 years. We are anticipating that verification will change with our ability to verify more remotely, and technology will assist in that. For instance, the volumetric water benefit we will be able to report on every year. But other things, that vegetation change obviously takes considerably longer, and it's expensive to do that. So therefore, that's why there's milestones involved in that. Next slide, please, Lisa. Really, the voluntary market has adapts conservativeness and uses buffers. So uncertainty buffer is important. So if direct measurement, we can state the uncertainty level. If the uncertainty level becomes too high, then we need to make a deduction. Where we're using models, we will deduct 10% automatically from the gross figure. Then there's also a risk buffer, and this is a standard figure across the voluntary market, and it's a 20% sort of communal insurance buffer. And that unforeseen circumstances would be wildfire, 40-day drought, and ongoing impact then on water level, ammonium deposition. So it's there to protect the investor and as well the landowner or project developer. What happens to the risk buffer? It's not owned by the landowner. It's not owned by the standard. It is held by the standard, and we're looking at a way to return that to the community eventually if it's in the hope it's unused. So really, gross data, we would subtract from leakage. That is, if something happened within the estate to intensify activity on another piece of land because of a restoration project, we would deduct an uncertainty buffer if there was one, and definitely the risk buffer. So the net claim, might be 72% of the gross data that we calculate. The principles that are referred to in the standard, the 10 carbon principles are listed on the left-hand side of that slide, and we'll come back to those in questions. Next slide, please, Licia. Okay. So that was a quick run through. It's impossible to do more than that, but there may be questions, and they could be added to the chat box, would be useful. So I'm going to hand back to Shane now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, folks. So I'd like to open the floor, please, if I may. There are now 44 people in attendance, and if you take away the organisers of this, we're just under 40, which is a fantastic response and contribution here. I see some attendance from, well, those emails that I can see anyway, and that others can, I'm sure, as well, attendance from various ACRES projects, from the European Investment Bank, from state departments, and various others that I can't see the email string attached to. But I will please encourage you all to either put questions into the Q&A, which I'm opening now, and I don't see anything in, or indeed simply raise your hand